Hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Bazubitz, President and CEO of the Royal, one of Canada's leading mental health and research centres. My team and I are very pleased to partner with Rogers TV Ottawa for another special edition of Conversations at the Royal during Mental Health Week. As a care, research, and teaching hospital, our goal is to help bring the latest information on treatments and research findings in mental health to you, the public. At the Royal, we provide care to individuals from 16 years of age to the elderly, all who experience important mental health and addiction challenges. We also serve veterans and active members of the Canadian Forces and the RCMP for an operational stress injury they might have incurred while serving our country on humanitarian missions. Every client at the Royal receives best-in-class care informed by cutting-edge research to live their best life. This week, you will hear from many of our amazing clinicians who are passionate about the care they provide and the research that will lead to novel treatments and new discoveries in mental health and addictions care. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Michele Todd, an amazing and dedicated clinical psychologist in the Operational Stress Injury Clinic we operate for Veterans Affairs. Michele provides psychological assessments and care to veterans, active soldiers of the Canadian Forces, and police officers in the RCMP who have experienced an operational stress injury as a result of serving our country. Michele is also a caring educator in our community. She has helped provide important information about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the many treatments that can help people. Michele has given many presentations as part of the Royal's public conversations, but also on helping our community understand and process their exposure to traumatic events that our city has seen over the past decade. Michele is also an important and innovative trainer in healthcare in the country. She is a certified and expert trainer in prolonged exposure therapy, one of the most effective treatments in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Her presentation today will focus on healing from trauma. Michele will offer a perspective on how trauma is defined, how people respond to trauma, and most importantly, what is the process of healing after experiencing, witnessing, or learning about traumatic events. Michele will also share what signs to look for and how individuals can benefit from working with a mental health professional. For those interested in better understanding trauma and how to overcome its impact, Michele is a wonderful guide who provides hope to clients and learners across the country. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening to Conversations at the Royal.
Hi, everyone. I'm here during Mental Health Week to talk about trauma and PTSD. Particularly during times of conflict or crisis, it's normal to wonder about how these events might affect us and what to do if they impact us personally or impact someone that we care about. So it's important to talk about mental health to reduce stigma and to spread the word that help is available. So today I'll be talking about what trauma is, how people react to traumatic events, and distinguishing this from post-traumatic stress disorder, highlighting some of the signs and symptoms to be aware of, and addressing some common misconceptions about PTSD that might contribute to keeping people stuck. We'll also talk about some suggestions for coping after trauma and how to help someone else cope, as well as when it might be advisable to seek help from a professional. There are really effective treatments for PTSD, and I'll share what to look for based on what research tells us about the most promising approaches right now. We'll start with understanding what trauma is and what it's not. So, a trauma can be something that happens to us directly, something that we see happen to someone else, or something that we learn about happening to someone that we're close to. Trauma has many faces and can include events like accidents, natural disasters, domestic violence, physical or sexual assault, a death that is sudden or unexpected or violent, experiencing war, either as a civilian or as a military member in combat, acts of terrorism, or hate crimes. And when media brings coverage of these events to us, many people wonder whether exposure to this news can itself be a trauma. For some people who have a direct connection to the events, like having a family member or a close friend who's in a war zone, or having a job that requires constant exposure to situations or to graphic details, this can be traumatic. And even for those who don't, while we may not call it a trauma, this kind of exposure can be very distressing. So, these and many other kinds of events can be upsetting and can impact us emotionally, like losing someone that we love to natural causes, being bullied, having very significant challenges in relationships, or major stresses at work or home or school. But we do distinguish between trauma and other types of stressful events. It's also important to know that trauma can happen to anyone at any age. It really doesn't discriminate. And trauma is unfortunately fairly common. So, this is something that we're going to come back to in just a moment. Because trauma is so common, it's important to know how it can impact us. So, most people who experience any kind of trauma will have a whole range of normal responses in the days and weeks that follow. These can include being really preoccupied by what happened, with unwanted thoughts, having bad dreams, or feeling intensely upset by things that might remind us of the event. And often, as a way of coping, people might avoid going out or interacting with others. They might withdraw from their normal activities, or they might use other coping strategies like drinking more alcohol or using substances. And there can also be really intense emotional reactions like anxiety or sadness. People may also notice that they feel edgy or irritable in a way that's unlike them to be. And being preoccupied in this way can cause trouble keeping focused on things that we need to do, can disrupt our daily routines, and it can also contribute to physical symptoms like insomnia or changes in appetite, feeling really fatigued, or having tension or headaches. So, all of these are really normal reactions to something that's so out of the ordinary. They're indications that something very impactful has happened and that we're sort of struggling to make sense of it and how it fits into what we thought and expected before the trauma, and also understandably trying to find ways of protecting ourselves from something bad happening again. So estimates really vary depending on the population, but typically research suggests that more than half of people and up to 3/4 of people may experience a trauma at some point in their lives. There's some Canadian data that suggests that 75 or 76% of Canadians will experience a trauma at some point. And similarly, documented rates of PTSD also vary, but generally suggest that about 8 or 9% of people may at one point experience this condition. And that's a pretty standard, consistent discrepancy in this difference between people who are trauma exposed and people who eventually go on to develop PTSD. So oftentimes, people who are trauma exposed do begin to feel better over time, although the idea that time heals all wounds is not quite true when it comes to trauma. So we know that after experiencing trauma, there are certain things that help and other things that are likely to get in the way of people starting to feel better. So researchers have actually followed people after they've experienced trauma to answer some of the questions about why this is the case. And for many people, the symptoms start to decline within several weeks of the trauma. And the question is, how does this happen? So that same research suggests that there are a few important differences in circumstances and a few other factors between people who do and people who don't recover naturally on their own. One of the key differences that we may be able to harness is that people who recover start to reestablish their previous activities. So by slowly starting to reverse the pattern of avoidance and withdrawal. And we've learned that one reason this is so important is because it helps give us a different perspective on what this event means. So as an example, someone who's had a very serious car accident might understandably feel very anxious and might avoid driving because it feels like it's likely that they'll have another crash. So avoiding driving feels like a relief in the moment because by staying home, the possibility of having an accident is avoided. But this can be a double-edged sword because as long as driving is avoided, it might also be hard to recognize that although accidents can and do happen, they're relatively uncommon. But if somebody gradually starts to drive again, maybe first on side roads and eventually on the highway, they can build back their confidence in their ability, and they might learn over time that driving can be relatively safe. Another important factor is whether we have access to and whether we use our social support. So being able to lean on people that we trust is not only comforting and gives us a sense that we're not alone, but it may also be a safe space to talk about how the event has impacted us, which is important in working through our thoughts and feelings about it. On the other hand, there are some things that can get in the way of feeling better. And these are all things that we may do in the service of protecting ourselves or feeling better in the moment, but they end up being more unhelpful in the long run. So continuing to avoid is one example. Being extra careful about dangers that we might possibly encounter in our life, in our world. Trying to push away thoughts and memories that are upsetting, which again is very understandable, and finding ways to distract ourselves, or continuously ruminating about the event itself or how we reacted to it, being very watchful for signs of threat, which we call vigilance, using alcohol or medications, or giving up enjoyable activities. So for some people, these coping habits might actually have predated the trauma. So they could be things that we learned to lean on early on in our lives, or responses to expectations. So for example, that we should be tough or push through, that we shouldn't express emotions. They can also have roots in other places, like a job environment that encourages strength or toughness. Other risk factors for non-recovery include things that happened before the trauma, like experiencing other traumatic events or having a personal or family history of mental health difficulties. The nature and the severity of the trauma itself, of course, is a factor. And after the trauma, having other really significant stresses or lacking in support or having a very intense early reaction to the trauma might all be things that contribute to the development of ongoing difficulties. So we saw before that some people who experience trauma will go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, it's PTSD for short. PTSD is a mental health condition diagnosed by mental health professionals that can happen after any kind of trauma and after any number of traumatic events. So you'll notice that when we review these symptoms that we eventually call PTSD, these are the same ones that are very normal responses early on. So people with PTSD often have intense nightmares, and they might remember the trauma often when they don't want to. Sometimes these can be memories that are so vivid that it feels more like reliving the event than it does like remembering it, which is an experience that we call flashbacks. And because these experiences are so upsetting, most people with PTSD try to push these experiences and the memory of the trauma away by avoiding things, that might trigger these memories to happen. So they may start to avoid situations, places they used to go to, and other people that they didn't avoid before. And they might also feel the need to avoid their own internal experiences, like their thoughts and feelings, by finding ways to suppress them. For example, by keeping themselves very busy, by overscheduling themselves, or using distractions to excess, like television or the internet, which are all very normal activities, but done in service of pushing these thoughts and feelings away. PTSD can also change how we feel and how we think about ourselves and other people. So, contributing to self criticism and blame, making it difficult to trust other people. It may also seem like it's difficult to be safe anywhere, or that we expect bad things to happen around every corner. And although we usually think about fear when we think about PTSD, it can also lead to a variety of other emotions, including shame, guilt, grief, anger, or not being able to feel anything, which we call numbness. And lastly, PTSD can make people feel as though they're in a constant state of alertness, which can result in being unusually irritable, being easily startled, or feeling very vigilant about our surroundings. It may also make it difficult to sleep or concentrate, all of which can get in the way of our ability to go about our daily routine. So, if many of these are normal reactions, these are some additional indicators that mental health professionals consider to determine if PTSD is present. So, firstly, how long have these symptoms lasted? So, we're looking typically for a duration of more than 1 month, and that the symptoms are happening much of the time. Secondly, how intense is the distress? So, how significant is the person's anxiety or sadness, grief? And very importantly, in what way do these symptoms disrupt important areas of life? So, PTSD causes a lot of impairment in relationships by creating distancing or conflict. It disrupts activities through avoidance and withdrawal. It can cause difficulties at work or school, including missing work or feeling distracted or ineffective while we're there. And it can impact our ability to care for ourselves. So, our physical activity, our other health habits, and our daily routines. Before we talk about what to do in response to trauma, I want to just review some very common misconceptions about PTSD. One of the most common things that we hear in clinical practice is that PTSD is a lifelong illness, and that all treatment can do is help people to manage with their symptoms. And we know that not everyone will recover, and that recovery doesn't mean forgetting about the trauma or going back to just the way that things were before it occurred. But a lot of research suggests that people with PTSD can move forward following a trauma with the painful memory as part of their experience, of course, but with far fewer symptoms of PTSD, and for many people, even without the symptoms of PTSD that we just talked about. Another very damaging misconception, which is a belief that many people with PTSD will express about themselves, is that PTSD is somehow a sign of weakness. And simply put, we know that this simply isn't true. So, as we saw before, most people have very similar reactions to trauma. And it seems to be that for some folks, something or many things might get in the way of them recovering successfully. So, that being said, next slide, what can we do to cope if we do experience a trauma? So, first and foremost, the most important thing in the very early stages is to reestablish safety and to ensure that other basic needs are being met, like shelter and food, and feeling secure. Once those basics are in place, as much as it's natural to want to push these upsetting things away, it is important eventually to make time to process what we've experienced. And our best supports are the people in our lives that we trust the most. This may mean, but not always, talking about the event itself. Or maybe this means sharing our thoughts and feelings about it with people that we trust. This is an important part of making meaning of an incomprehensible event and starts us on the journey of putting it into the context of the rest of our life. It isn't useful to try to have a positive spin on the event itself. We're not trying to reimagine what happened. That isn't realistic, it's not helpful, and it's also not necessary for recovery. So instead, over time, what we're trying to do is to integrate this very negative event or events into the broader story of our life. And similarly, even though it's understandable to withdraw, over time, it's important to try to start re-engaging in the activities that you used to do before the trauma, starting one step at a time. So particularly if the trauma involved a loss of someone or something that was meaningful, this will also help us to reconnect with other sources of meaning. And while we want to avoid avoiding, so to speak, it's also important not to over-engage with information. For example, by saturating ourselves with news coverage or stories that are related to the trauma. Just a reminder to practice being patient and compassionate with yourself, understanding that recovery doesn't happen overnight and that there may be ups and downs along the way. And at the same time, it's also important to monitor yourself for signs that more help might be needed. And this is something that we'll come back to in a moment. So what if it's someone else who experienced a trauma, someone that we care about or that we love? It can be difficult for us to know how to talk to a loved one after a trauma or to know what kind of support to offer. And in some ways, this is very individual. But these are some general suggestions and guidelines that might be helpful. So first of all, like in other areas, knowledge is power. So accessing some information about trauma and PTSD can be really helpful as a first step in understanding both our loved ones' experiences as well as our own responses to them. So there are some really helpful books and websites with accurate information about trauma and PTSD that can be a helpful place to start. And some of those are listed in the resources at the end of this talk. This may also involve some acceptance of how the person that we love is initially coping. So in the first few days, because those early reactions to trauma are very normal, with a few exceptions, almost anything goes. We'll get to those exceptions in a moment, which may be cause for concern. And then as straightforward as it sounds, listening is very important. It can be difficult for people with PTSD to open up about their experiences and their emotions. So being available to talk and listening carefully and being non-judgmental gives space for someone to open up about their feelings. Not only that, but validating is a very powerful way of letting someone know that they're understood and that they aren't alone. And validating doesn't mean agreeing with the individual, particularly if they're expressing really self-critical beliefs or concerns about their safety that may not be realistic. But it means finding a way to let them know that we understand why they might be having these feelings. So offering that I would feel that way too in your shoes, or I can understand how you might think that way. And listening and validating does not mean taking on the role of a therapist. So for some, this might be something that's needed in addition to the care that loved ones can offer on their own. So if you're concerned that your loved one is struggling, or you feel like you're not sure how to provide support, you can also remind them that other kinds of support are available and ask them if they might be willing to seek some care. And if they're open to that, or if they're already going, you may also offer to go with them to some appointments if that's appropriate. either to help them get there or help them seek treatment, or if they're already doing so, maybe to learn about their treatment and how you may be able to support them. This could also mean offering some more practical supports that will free them up to help them attend their appointments or help them get there, or going with them to some of the activities that they might be practicing during their treatment. And it goes without saying that it's important also to take care of yourself if you're supporting somebody else. So, like the often used analogy of putting on your own oxygen mask before helping others put on theirs, trying to balance offering support with making time to keep taking care of yourself by doing activities you enjoy, by taking care of your basics like eating and sleeping and exercising properly. And if you need to, maybe also accessing your own forms of support. What about any ways that may not be helpful for offering support to loved ones after a trauma? So all of these can occur with the best of intentions, but may be counterproductive. So sometimes we have a bit of a righting reflex. We want to be able to help and we want someone to feel better. And we might experience an urge to help a person by encouraging them to be positive or look on the bright side. So offering that everything will be okay, or that they have a lot to be happy for. And while these things may eventually be true, unfortunately, this might unintentionally minimize the person's experience or convey that the person is making too much of the trauma and might lead to further reluctance to talk. Encouragement is often helpful, but as tempting as it might be to jump in and help, it may be best not to act on behalf of the other person. And it goes without saying that expressing judgment or conveying that the person's experiences aren't normal won't likely be helpful. And lastly, to understand that our loved ones' reactions, like withdrawal or irritability or avoidance, are related to the trauma rather than being related to us and our relationship with them. So it's also important to know when more support might be needed. So any of these factors indicate a more urgent need that should be addressed immediately. So these include experiencing thoughts about dying by suicide or harming oneself or somebody else, engaging in risky or unsafe behaviors like reckless driving or spending or risky sexual behaviors that have the potential to cause harm. And while we know that alcohol or substance use can be a form of coping and isn't unusual following a trauma, excessive use that interferes in daily life or in goals is a cause for concern. And lastly, if somebody's unable to care for themselves or their dependents, so for example, having difficulty meeting basic needs, it's also an indication of a more immediate need. So if you or someone that you love is at risk, safety always comes first. So we always want you to use crisis services before anything else. You can pick up the phone and call 911 or go in person to the nearest emergency room. Many communities also have mental health crisis lines or mobile crisis teams who can provide more immediate assessment or assistance as well. Once any urgent needs have been addressed, it can be difficult to know what kind of treatment to seek or to ask for. So one of the things that we want people to know is, just like in physical health care, there are what we would call first-line treatments for PTSD that have been shown through a lot of extensive study to be very effective. Right now, and this could change, these are what we call the cognitive behavioral therapies, cognitive processing therapy, and prolonged exposure, or EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing. Each of these treatments uses slightly different strategies, but with the same overall objective. So, not to change the trauma itself, but to change the things that might be unintentionally keeping the PTSD symptoms going and to help the person move forward from the trauma in a meaningful way. So, prolonged exposure is a treatment that provides information to clients about PTSD symptoms and helps them to gradually confront situations that they've been avoiding through a process called exposure. There's also an element of recounting the memory of the most distressing event that the person has experienced to help that individual process their thoughts and feelings about it. In cognitive processing therapy, or CPT, a client also is provided with information about PTSD and is helped to identify the impact of the event that they've experienced on their thoughts and beliefs, and to practice strategies to challenge unhelpful trauma related thoughts to arrive at some more realistic ways of thinking. And in EMDR, clients are helped to revisit traumatic memories while also focusing on moving stimuli, which is called bilateral stimulation. So the common elements of these treatments include some form of revisiting the trauma memories or the beliefs about them to facilitate making sense of what's occurred. And all of them seem to borrow a few of those elements of the natural recovery process that some folks are able to do on their own through their natural supports. So although no treatment works for everyone universally, these treatments are very effective in helping many people have either significantly fewer symptoms of PTSD or, in many cases, in no longer having symptoms of PTSD. So if you or someone that you know has experienced trauma and needs support, please reach out for resources. A really good place to start, if you aren't experiencing significant symptoms, is with the people around you. So your family, your friends, colleagues that you trust, or other community or spiritual groups that you may belong to that are important to you. If you have one, your family physician is also an excellent resource and a good place to start. So they may be aware of resources that could help or help you to determine what kind of assistance you might need or whether you need assistance at the moment. Some employers also offer employee assistance programs that offer counseling services. And you can also check the websites, for example, of professional regulatory bodies, such as the College of Psychologists or the College of Social Workers. There are also directories available online, such as the one that's available at the Canadian Psychological Association that lists providers. And while not specific to trauma or PTSD, Access MHA is a service that provides rapid coordinated access to mental health and addiction services in the Champlain region by matching needs to the services that are available in any given community. And the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy Program offers short-term, evidence-based interventions for anxiety and mood disorders, as well as for PTSD. So the take-home message that I'd like to leave you with is that although trauma is very common, and some people will go on to develop symptoms of PTSD following a trauma, we want you to know that there is help available and that treatments for PTSD have excellent success rates. Please connect with any of the resources available here if you or someone that you love needs help. Thank you.